and go home in peace.
Buonasera a tutti, sono Francesco Manacorda di Repubblica e stasera aspetta a me il compito di moderare questo incontro che ci sarà sulla nuova globalizzazione e in particolare il dibattito che avremo dopo, Which Capitalism for Which Economy. E incomincerei però dando la parola subito a Cosimo Palazzo, che è segretario generale della Fondazione Giangiacomo Feltrinelli.
Thank you, Mr. Manacorda, and good evening. Well, this is the last of the Feltrinelli camps that characterized Sarabanda 2021, our research and discussion season that we are about to close with the talk, The Politics to Come, on schedule tomorrow. Sarabanda 2021 was designed during the second lockdown as an agenda of scientific activities and public initiatives that we conceived in reliance on the fact that the autumn would restore us to a social life no longer threatened by the pandemic. This is why the work groups of the three Feltrinelli camps, the first, Broken Cities, the second, Next Generation Labor, and this one, New Globalization, set the pace for this last part of our agenda. After the months focused on research and after the Summer Festival of Arts Languages, we dedicated the months from September to now to the practices, the confrontation, and the integration of the analysis, the perspectives, and the experiences of those involved in the institutions, in companies, in politics, and in the service sector. Let me thank our partner, Eni, for supporting us in this European project. While today we are here in person and enjoy the opportunity to continue along this common path, this multi-sided confrontation, we still perceive an increasing apprehension with respect to the risk of new health emergencies. And facing such threat, today's topic is key. And the title of this camp takes the perspective value of commitment we should take without hesitation for a new globalization, an urgency that deals with the deeply rooted ethical belief that we need to fill the gaps that break up the planet and that globalized financial capitalism made even broader. But this emergency is dramatically represented today by the new Omicron variant, first identified in Botswana and then in several infected patients in South Africa. The so-called South African variant has already struck the markets with the subsequent crash of stock exchanges that, according to analysts, could change the trend of recovery and has already brought along new restrictions on border closing. But the broad debate and the prompt response this new emergency should arouse deal with vaccines, with the need to ensure that all the people in the African continent may access vaccines to the same extent as those that live in Europe or in the United States. It is a priority not to let rich countries buy up doses, to promptly deliver the ordered and promised ones, to release licenses on vaccines. Well, news in these days are about a system that needs to be reformed. about a global scenario that makes our interconnection even more obvious and can no longer accept such an imbalance. To do this, collective awareness is mandatory, but it is also useful for the states and supranational institutions to resume their role facing the overflowing power of markets. Since the 1970s, the nature of capitalism has changed from socially integrated capitalism to neoliberalism, deregulation, and financialization. The state market balance has shifted to the detriment of the democratic institutions. The growing denationalization of the economy and of the political decision-making process has developed in parallel with the supremacy of the financial markets over politics. The democratic state has lost its power vis-à-vis the economic players. However, facing the pandemic and the climate crisis, the intervention of the state is back to the heart of our economic, social, and political life. The Annus Horribilis 2020 triggered an important reinstatement of the European social state. In March 2021, exactly 1 year after the coronavirus epidemic was declared a pandemic, an article in The Economist described the fiscal stimulations approved in response to the COVID emergency as the greatest expansion of the welfare state in living memory. The first reaction to the pandemic and to its associated economic impacts across Europe was much stronger, both at EU and at member state level, than at the time of the Great Recession and of the European subprime crisis. It is still unclear whether this is a temporary phase, like the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, or a stable and active return to the state, to the economic stage. The return of the state, if it proves capable to start a serious reform process aimed at rebuilding its operational capacity to direct public policy, could surely open up new opportunities for action towards renewed innovation, a more democratic economy, the revival of the industrial policy. But this can only happen if the players involved, including public, private, and non-profit ones, are willing to change and to interact in view of agreeing and converging. Such an alliance between the public and the private sector could help us manage, in a fair and inclusive manner, the major processes of our time, from global heating to pandemics, from sustainable development to the struggle against inequalities, from the digital divide to the attainment of equal opportunities. We have partly tried to deal with these issues in our latest annals, curated by Enrica Chiappero Martinetti, available in bookstores since yesterday with the title Social Justice in a Global Society. The stake is high, social justice in a global world. But this is a challenge we cannot avoid. As Salvatore Veca wrote in the introduction to these annals, it is about combining the idea of justice as equity with the idea of democratic equality. These are the principles that can help us find our way in these uncertain times, fraught with ordeals and opportunities. Thank you.
Let me apologize with the organization. With you, I've been told that I have to introduce everybody in English. I started with Italian, but he will forgive me. So I'll introduce Antonio Maglio, that is the head of Human Knowledge Program of Joule, of ENI, that is sponsoring and helping this initiative.
Thank you very much. Good evening to all people that are here in presence. I'm very happy to be here because I was even here last year. Then I know very well what you are doing now, what you will do even tomorrow, what you are going to discuss during at the end of these 2 days. As ENI, we are very proud of being here as partner of this camp for the globalization. We are here because we are part of the transition. We are in a very strong period of transformation as ENI, and we are very glad to be here and support such initiative where you, as people involved in during this days to support with your ideas, with your very, very important ideas, what is able to change or to transform our economies. What I was able to read about this camp, it was try to imagine something that is going beyond our imagination, our limit, because our limit can be really you can overcome all by our imagination. Our limits are just relevant to our imagination. As you and I, we are trying to go beyond with all of you. We are very keen to support all ecosystems where public sectors and private companies such as you and I or other companies can support, let's say, this transition period. As you and I, we are inside the transition. We are going to overcome this period through our, let's say, people, our assets, our networking, our relationship, and we want to do that through even our partners. And through this initiative, something very, very crucial for us. As you know, we are committed to an equal energy transition, and we think that such initiative can really support this. I was last year on the other side because I was involved in a round table in a camp such as today's camp. I can assure this is what I take away that I got from last year, that the contamination among all ideas was very, very important for me, and even for my experience, this was, let's say, tangible assets that you will see, all of you will take away from this camp. And I think that after this roundtable, you will get this type of energy, this type of motivation, engagement. And we are, again, I want to highlight that we are very proud to be here. I hope that what you will discuss tomorrow after your effort that you are going to have, that you got today and you will get even tomorrow, will give the opportunity to policymakers, because or other institutions, all stakeholders, to think about the future. Let's say, we used to say, let's shape the future together. This is something very, very crucial, and you have this opportunity. So try to go beyond your imagination, providing, let's say, ideas that will try to shape our future. Because thanking you, this future will happen. Let's try to build up a future that will improve our life. This is why we are here. Again, I want to provide you with these words because we think that is very, very important. We are partner of this event. We want to be here, and with Feltrinelli Foundation, we are a partner since 2018, and is something that is a long journey that will continue. I hope with your energy will continue more and more. Thank you again, and have a good work.
Thank you to Antonio Maglio, and now I will start a debate with some intervention, and I will ask Orsola Costantini, that is in presence here, to come with me. She's Economic Affairs Officer of United Nations UNCTAD, and we should have a video connection with Professor Jeffrey Sachs, that you all know, from Columbia University. And after that, another video connection with Isabella Weber from University of Massachusetts, that is here. Hello, Isabella. Good evening.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Good evening.
And we are waiting for Professor Sachs as well. So we can... Okay. We have the usual technical problems, so we can start with something. So, Isabella, I will start with you, if you don't mind. You you started quite a lot about China, and you should explain us today what is happening in China in front of this public health emergency, economic, I don't know if we can call it an emergency as well, but what happened in China and what is happening right now?
Yeah, these are great and big questions. So would you like me to start with my 10 minutes input right now?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. It is a great honor to be on this panel, and I would like to thank the Feltrinelli Foundation for this invitation. It is a true privilege to discuss the big questions you are raising with Professor Sachs, whose constructive interventions on the question of the US-China relations I have much appreciated, and whose work I have followed for many years. In this short input, I would like to share thoughts on two questions. The first question is China creating a new kind of economic system? This question has come to the fore in light of the so-called crackdown of the Chinese state against big tech companies in other sectors, but also in the context of the very different responses to the COVID-19 crisis and the concerns around creating a resilient economy. Like the prominent scholar Barry Norton and others, I argue that China has indeed created a new kind of economic system that challenges us as political economists to come up with new conceptual frameworks. This leads me to the second question. Does this mark a break with China's path of market reforms that originated in the 1980s? Voices who see the Chinese state as striking back and warn of a lost promise of China's marketization suggest that what we see is indeed a break from the past, is a break with the past trajectory of marketization. This perspective, I argue, is built on the assumption that, broadly speaking, there's only one model of a market economy that is derived from the European and American experience. From this perspective, marketization appears to amount to westernization, and China's market reforms used to be interpreted as a process of institutional convergence with the Western model. Yet, by now, it is clear that while China is converging with the US in terms of its weight in the global economy, this has not come along with a wholesale institutional assimilation. As I argue in my book, How China Escaped Shock Therapy, this tension between China's re-emergence without wholesale institutional assimilation to the neoliberal model defines our present moment and can be traced to the 1980s. Already in the very early years of reform in China, it was a dominant view among China's political leaders and economists that China needed more market in order to catch up economically. But the big question of China's market reform debate was how to create markets in China's command economy. Should China destroy the core of its planning institutions to make space for the market to emerge spontaneously? Or should China liberalize the margins of the economic system, but at the core of the system use the institutions of the planned economy as market creators and market shapers? Both positions have been forcefully argued in China since the 1980s. China ultimately pursued the second path. It has been a gradualist, experimentalist reform approach that has created a radical transformation of China's economic system. In the course of reform, planning institutions were transformed from entities that articulated and implemented commands into market creators and participants steering markets in pursuit of broad political goals. As a result of more than 40 years of China's reforms, China's economy is deeply marketized. But rather than defending and encasing markets as in the neoliberal model, the Chinese state has created the capacity to be an active participant in essential market, as if there was a central bank for all important sectors engaging in open market operations. The state is using markets as a tool in pursuit of evolving political goals. There's no assumption of a zero-sum game between markets and the state. From this perspective, what we see today is not a sudden strike back of the state, but rather the emergence of a new set of political priorities and the rebalancing of the power between private and state actors in a market economy, where new kind of sectors have become essential to the workings of the economy as a whole. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Are we still waiting for Jeffrey Sachs? Okay. So it's a private failure of the private companies that should assure a connection that we don't have right now. So maybe we can go on with Orsola Costantini, asking her if her experience about, I understand mostly the Indian situation or the poorest countries. Sorry about it. We can go on with Orsola Costantini, asking if our experience and our studies with the poorest countries show a different pattern, of course, with respect to China. You have an introduction as well. And if you would start with your introduction, then we'll have some questions for you. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Is it working? Okay. Well, I've been asked actually to talk a little bit about the multilateralism and multilateral system, and specifically about the role of European Union in the multilateral system. I think this is actually quite fitting relative to what Isabella has been saying, and I mean, I say Isabella because we've known each other for a while, but I should say Professor Weber and Professor Sachs will be saying. Let me start from the beginning, or at least the beginning of the system in which we live today, which rose out of the ashes of the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, so in 1971. At the time, what happened is that all the conditions that until then had supported long-term development in the south of the world disappeared. We are talking of those conditions included stability of exchange rates, control of capital flows, all together with control of price of commodities and sustained and stable price of commodities, low real cost of finance, and also high growth and fiscal expansion in the countries of the North. And this is an important point I will get to later. In fact, the system that replaced this Bretton Woods system, post-war system, essentially supported the implementation of the opposite side, the opposite policies in all these fields. Including liberalization, privatization, fiscal austerity, and free trade, even if we should say free trade within quotes, of course, and I'll also get to that. The main point that I wanted to mention today is that this system is also an incoherent system from a macroeconomic point of view. What it means is that there are some fallacies at the basis of it, which imply that, for example, one, it's impossible for all countries to grow and have external surpluses simultaneously and globally, okay? And this means that on the one hand, those countries who even can succeed in running external surpluses and structure their production in order to be able to in this export-oriented fashion, anyway depend on external demand, on something that they do not control, they do not have particular control of, but even with their own policies, they subdue. Okay, so their own policies diminish global growth and global demand, but which is the one source of growth they depend on. Deficit countries, on the other hand, are in this system forced to fix their imbalances by internal deflation and fiscal austerity, which brings me to the second fallacy that is at the basis of this system, which is the fact that fiscal austerity and attempts at running budget deficits can be self-defeating, meaning that doesn't mean necessarily that if you're trying to cut expenditures, your deficit will actually decrease, because your revenues will also decrease. And especially, and this is another global fallacy as well. Even the countries that do manage to reduce their indebtedness, public indebtedness this way, they become more fragile nonetheless. And this is because if you reduce the size of the public sector, if you reduce the size of the automatic stabilizers, that are those elements of the economy that react automatically when there's a recession or a crisis and support income in that circumstance, and on the other end, try help when let's say creating a more sustainable growth, so avoiding big booms. There can be inflationary, for example. If you cut all that, obviously what you get is a more unstable economy, and also you find your governments find themselves in a situation when they have to spend more whenever there is a crisis, especially discretionary expenditures on elements and structures that may not be, that possibly are not, it's not possible to build just overnight, like the experience we had with the COVID crisis. Obviously, it was a big problem, the fact that they had disinvested in hospitals and healthcare structures, which obviously could not be just rebuilt overnight. While this system that eventually was dubbed the Washington Consensus was being built since the 80s, but then was refined and dubbed this way in the 90s, economists at UNCTAD, which is the organization where I currently work, developed two main concepts that I think can be useful to understand this, both the situation and what can be done about it, which are the concept of interdependence and policy space. So interdependence has two main meanings. I don't know if I'm going on for too long, but you please, okay. One is that essentially the sources of growth matter, the domestic growth matter. So if a country is growing because there's a high internal demand or an high external demand, it has an impact globally. And this is even more so the case for countries that are big, large economies, developed economies. So the main idea behind this concept of interdependence is that the policies of developed countries matter for global growth and determine the policy space of developing countries. So policy space is not something developing countries can control entirely. It depends on what developed countries do. And the other concept that's related to this, the other meaning of interdependence is the interdependence of policies. That is, interdependence of fiscal, monetary, trade, and finance policies. Just as an example, if you have, if you lower interest rates and you try to do unconventional monetary policy because you're trying to support the economy and support growth, but at the same time you do not regulate capital flows, you do not regulate speculation, you do not support those institutions like unions that can help create a stronger, a higher equality at the source, then your impact is not going to be what you hoped for, because expansionary monetary policy is going to have an effect on assets and create further speculation and booms in sectors that are not productive and are not going to produce stronger growth. So interdependence of policies. Another example.
Maybe also, Costantini, I should ask you to take a break right now, because Jeffrey Sachs is with us for a very short time, unfortunately. So if you do not mind, I understand it's not very fair from my side to ask you to continue after, but we have Jeffrey Sachs here for a very limited time. So they're asking me to give...
No problem.
To give the... Hello. Good evening, Jeffrey Sachs. Can you hear us? We cannot hear you. Well, Jeffrey, you cannot hear us? You can, but we cannot hear you. We don't hear you. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, now we got something.
Hello?
Yes, you are with us now.
Now you hear?
No, you are with us, but not in a comprehensible way. Okay. I hope they will connect later.
Hello?
And sorry, also, Costantini, I will ask you to continue. I'm very sorry about it.
No problem. So yeah, one other fundamental example of this interdependence of policies is the fact that, for example, if a developing country who's dependent on imports for its production wants to run a fiscal expansion, it may become a problem unless they are able to also at the same time run some import substituting policies. Those, however, could be barred, could be impossible, depending on trade agreements, conditionalities on loans. So all policies that are not strictly fiscal, but have an impact on the fiscal policy and the policy space in general that these countries have. And so, if we're getting to talk a little bit about the role of the European Union based on this framework that I've sketched, hopefully sufficiently with sufficient clarity. When at UNCTAD we, in our reports, categorize countries for their input on global growth, all the main European countries, all the main countries of the European Union, France, Germany, France, and Italy, they represent an outright global deflationary stance. What does it mean? It means that both the internal demand grows less than their output, and their internal demand grows less than the global demand, which means that they not only they grow very slowly, they subtract resources from global growth. Their role, so the role macroeconomically speaking, not politically speaking, I'm just talking macroeconomically, has been detrimental to policy space in developing countries. To that, we have to add other elements. The fact that being export-oriented, the European Union is one of the main actors in lobbying in WTO and other circumstances for trade agreements that are favorable to their countries and their big corporations. This is something that developing countries do not have often the capacity to react to, and has been a problem. One example that we all know about, obviously, is the vaccine waiver, which the European Union is, in fact, the main country that is blocking this from happening, which is something, you know, posterity will judge us, I think, not very kindly for that. But the main problem so we understand now why trade and trade agreements, especially trade agreements that lately have become in this Washington Consensus framework, something that encompasses not just trade per se or tariffs, but also elements that connect with the possibility of state aid for production. And financial services, so also financial deregulation is part of these trade deals. So all that, the main problem from a multilateral perspective is that there is no institution multilateral institution where these deals can really be agreed on, and there is no framework where developing countries really can be supported in these negotiations. The WTO is obviously not the place for that, it hasn't been, and even though now there is a reform under discussion, but again, obviously, the reform will reflect the power differences among regions of the world. One example that I think is very telling about this has to do with the COP that just happened in Edinburgh. At the same time, we saw at the COP big announcements about the necessity, big targets of countries saying we will achieve this and that, but then at the same time at the WTO you have agreements being discussed which do not take into account the possibility of the necessity for developing countries to have financial, access the finance necessary to acquire the technology, discussions of border tax, carbon taxes, for example, that directly impact the capacity of developing countries to actually achieve these goals. So again, a multilateral system that is incoherent because sets goals that because of its very architecture cannot be achieved. What can be a coherent multilateral system? A coherent multilateral system is a system that allows for multilateral negotiation, discussions of and coordination of monetary, fiscal, exchange rate policies and trade policies. UNCTAD, for example, has for long supported the institution of a debt authority for a resolution of sovereign debt issues, and again has insisted that trade and discussion of trade terms globally need to be a part of a discussion of how debt problems can be resolved. So again, a problem, not one single problem, but a web of problems that need to be addressed coherently together. Again, speaking of the European Union in this context, we know that after the crisis, I mean, during the COVID crisis, it's not over, unfortunately. The European Union has announced this as, first of all, suspended the fiscal rules, has announced a larger package than ever before, a fiscal package to be distributed to the member countries, 750 billions, of which 390 were transfers. That amounts to 0.5% of the European Union GDP. And that's not, those are not all going to be investments and are all sorts of transfers as well. That obviously is not a big package, especially compared to, well, China, of course, but even the US. Also I noticed, for example, in Italy, most of the expenditures are going to be implemented starting later, probably the end of 2022. I suspect that one of the reasons is because the Stability and Growth Pact might in fact be reinstated. So if that's the case, really this Next Generation EU fund is going to be the only deficit spending made available for the country. So if that is the case, we should understand that the global position of the European Union, both for macroeconomic by macroeconomic logic and by interest in terms of trade deals, is not going to change. Fortunately, there is an ongoing discussion about reforming the fiscal framework, and going back to what I was saying about the concept of interdependence, my hope is that if we reform the fiscal framework in Europe, that should reflect the fact that there are fiscal leakages between countries. So the same thing that I was saying before, that if one country has a dependence on imports, its fiscal expansion is going to leak to other countries, and especially in a monetary union, this is going to favor more competitive countries, like in this circumstance, but not before, Germany and the Netherlands, for example. So a fiscal framework needs to take into account for these differences. Yeah, I think it's...
May I ask you a question about it? You were talking about interdependence, and many factors have changed in these recent months and years. You talked before about the fiscal spending, the fiscal deficit. The rules about fiscal deficits are softening in some way in Europe in this particular moment, as well as the monetary policy is softening quite a lot. Is this a case that is helping just the European countries, or there could be some spillover on the space, the political space of developing countries as well?
No, for sure there has the expansionary monetary policy and the quantitative easing of developed countries helped developing countries in this circumstance, although quite asymmetrically sometimes. But the problem is that anytime the big fear is tapering. That is that whenever central banks of these developed countries decide that they want to raise interest rates, this is very likely, like in the past, going to create a chain reaction that is going to let capital flow out of developing countries and create a big crisis. Unless this is arranged differently, multilaterally, coordinating these monetary policy changes in a way that does not affect the stability of the rest of the world.
And also Europe in this moment seems very, very worried about its own survival in some way. Let's take all the things that are happening on its eastern borders and everything that is going on an economic point of view. Do you think Europe is missing an occasion right now to push for a more multilateral approach and to have a web of links with developing countries stronger than before?
Well, I'm going to be honest. I think they're not wasting any time so to avoid that from happening. Actually, the stance of the European Union multilateral institution has not been supportive, at least from an economic policy point of view, which is what I work in. This my field, obviously. I'm not talking of human rights or any of that, which is not my field.
Okay, thank you very much. And Isabella Weber, if I may, since we are missing Jeffrey Sachs, we have been told there is a blackout in Manhattan, so we are out of Chronicle and into history right now, but nothing works anymore. So let's hope everything is fine. But I will ask you to take a little bit of the part that Jeffrey Sachs was supposed to tell us and tell us about the Sino-American relation in this age, the not so good Sino-American relation in this age.
Well, let me say that I'm really not an expert on that question to begin with, and that I could certainly not replace Professor Sachs on that question. I guess the main gist of it is that it looks very worrying, and that whatever can be done to re-normalize relations is really very much in the interest in pursuing all the issues that Orsola has so eloquently and precisely laid out, because without US-China cooperation, I think the idea of having any kind of coherent multilateral framework is unfortunately wishful thinking. So whatever can be done and thought and initiated towards a renormalization of US-China relations, I think is really in the interest of all these big macroeconomic and really very foundational challenges that the world is facing, including climate change, the pandemic, and the list goes on, right? So in that sense, I guess I'm speaking in the spirit of Professor Sachs when I'm calling for US-China collaboration. And maybe it's worth mentioning that the very small collaboration that has happened is the one that was around the release of oil reserves that followed the US-China dialogue, which I think is a small but hopeful sign, in the sense that in addition to all these enormous challenges in global macroeconomics, we are of course also facing increasing challenges around massive fluctuations in commodity prices, which is a rearm that is particularly harmful for developing countries. I mean, for oil, it's of course the whole world that is directly affected, but for many commodities that are primarily produced in developing countries, and where some developing countries, in fact, pretty much depend for the well-being of the whole economy on exporting these kind of commodities, if we get the kind of massive fluctuations that we have had in oil and in these kind of commodities, which is very much in store in light of the extreme weather events that are pretty much certain to happen in light of climate change, then this kind of commodity stock adjustments, which is of course a proposal that was very much in the debate after the war in the context of the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions, and if I'm not mistaken, is also a proposal that has been revived by UNCTAD fairly recently. I'm sure Orsola can fill in the details, could be a rearm where China and the US possibly could collaborate and could in fact create at least an element of stability of key strategic commodities, which could be quite consequential for the macroeconomic and well-being of countries that depend on the export of such commodities. So in that sense, the agreement to release strategic oil reserves could be a small but hopeful sign towards larger initiatives in that direction coming from the US and China, if we argue in a very hopeful spirit.
And talking about cooperation and exchanges, how do you judge from an economic point of view and a political point of view, of course, the decision of China to stop most of the foreign investments of Chinese, let's say, private entrepreneurs in Western countries?
Well, I mean, let me preface this by saying that I'm really someone who has worked on the history of internal reforms, right? So this is really not my specific expertise. I think it has to be seen in the context of the enormous tensions in the US-China relations, where, of course, there have been major moves on the part of the US and major European countries to contain such Chinese investments. That has created enormous uncertainties around precisely such investments. And the Chinese state has, in some sense, reacted to that development that has been ongoing for several years by now, right? And has basically reacted in a reciprocal fashion by containing these same kind of investments. That would be my big picture interpretation, but I'm not an expert on the details.
I see, thank you. And well, since we are missing one speaker, I would like to have some questions from the public as well, if you have any questions. And I would be glad to hear them. And maybe if we can bring around a microphone, that would be fine. But I also would like to ask again, Isabella Weber, about reforms this time. How do you think the pandemic is changing the way the Chinese state is reforming the country and the economy, if?
Yeah, so 2021 was bound to be a watershed year for China. It is the year of the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party of China, and the Communist Party has a long tradition of governing around very long-term historical goals that are structured based on pretty long periods and often structured around key historical events and anniversaries, such as the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. So in 2021, the so-called first centenary goal that was defined in the late 90s, which was to build a moderately prosperous society in all respects, has been basically declared as achieved. And this has brought the second so-called centenary goal at the heart of the agenda, which is to build a modern socialist country that is prosperous, strong, democratic, culturally advanced, and harmonious, which is meant to be achieved by 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the revolution. And in this year, 2021, China has also issued only the third historical resolution in China's history. The first one was still before the revolution under Mao, the second one at the beginning of the reforms in 1981, and the third one this year, which shows you that basically we have a coincidence of the pandemic, of the massive global crisis that is evident to everybody around the world at this point, with these major predefined historical shifts that were meant to happen in 2021 in terms of the policy agenda, and that had been planned for a very long time. So I think it's important to see these two things in conjunction. And as a result of these two things happening at the same time, we do get a major reorientation in terms of the policy priorities. We clearly see that there is a greater emphasis on things like the dual circulation, which basically connects to your previous question, where the idea is that while China is not shutting itself out of the world, it still wants to basically rely more on domestic sources of growth. But at the same time, there's also a lot of talk around the creation of a new development model, which should rely less on GDP growth as the main driving force, but that should have a more comprehensive set of political goals that the economy should be working towards. So these are things like big slogans where the question right now is what will they ultimately mean? Things like the pursuit of an ecological civilization, the pursuit of common prosperity, the pursuit of national rejuvenation, which often also comes with this fairly nationalist orientation, which are all these like very big slogans that indicate the reorientation of the Chinese model towards new, very big goals. But this reorientation is one that is going to happen in a gradualist fashion. So basically, this is like earmarking big directions, but how this will exactly evolve is yet to be seen. So in that sense, we see this conjunction of the pandemic as a major emergency with these long-planned reorientations in the policy agenda that are not a radical break with history because they are long planned. They date back to the 90s. But at the same time, they do indicate that something new is in the making, and it remains to be seen what exactly that will be.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions from the public? Then I have one more question for you after.
I have a question both for Weber and Costantini about the role of economic theory in the process that we have described. For Professor Weber, I would like to ask what was the role of neoclassical theory in the changes in the market reform debate in China? And to Mrs. Costantini, I would like to ask what is the role now of neoclassical theory and all the theoretical justifications to the European Union action in this period? Is something changing? Because some people are talking about the paradigm shift, but it's I personally have some doubts about this, and I'm not, of course, the only one, and I would like to hear your opinion on this. Thank you.
Are you starting? No, let's start with this one, if you have one. It's a very precise question. So.
Okay. Thank you. What can I say? There are obviously reality has forced policy shifts that are undeniable, and has also forced to some extent to admit that certain policies that were considered taboos before are now almost common currency and accepted and considered inevitable. However, this basically happened also in 2008 and 2009 in the crisis. And what we saw then was that after big announcements of fiscal profligacy and fiscal support, coordinated fiscal support in the G20s at the time, already in 2010, there was a complete flip back to austerity, and so I was still studying at the time. I wasn't actively part of any of that, but my colleagues who were. When they started hearing these announcements in 2020, and all these new packages being announced, etc., they started saying, "Okay, so I'm counting the seconds before it's gonna flip back again to austerity," and that's seriously a risk that is there. Well, in Europe, the situation is particularly bleak. In the U.S. Could be a little better, but the problem, again, I think, is whether we settle to a situation where we have just counter-cyclical measure, so a system that is built so to provide counter-cyclically for only emergency, times of emergency, a certain amount of stimulus, and then draw back and go back to business as usual. This is problematic because it creates, it just subsidizes a reinterization of the economy, doesn't really promote structural sustainable development anywhere, and does not really provide even socially what we expect a government to do necessarily. And so I don't see I see in the words, in the announcements, in some of the big policy shifts that happened, a change. I don't see really a change in the theory adopted in the main reports, policy briefs of international organization. I don't see that in the plans that governments draft. That, even if you look at the Italian draft for the Italian plan for the use of the Next Generation EU funds, well, the simulation is just a same old model based on general equilibrium, which is, for those who are not familiar, is something that basically assumes full use of resources and especially employment. So there's a problem of a language of power, we can say, to simplify, that is entrenched in those methodologies. And even if in some circumstances there is the desire to to obtain different results, the structure of technicians and people employed in the international organization is such that you don't get away from that same language of power, let's say. And so it's very difficult, I think, to overcome this problem. And that's why it's good to point it out all the time that we can, that it is just a wrong theory and something that does not help in any way the production of and conception of good policies.
Thank you. If Isabella Weber has an answer to this question as well.
Yes, thank you for this question. I wish Professor Sachs was here. The title of my book is How China Escaped Shock Therapy, where shock therapy is, of course, grounded in neoclassical economics. And the basic argument of the book, which I'm developing in quite a bit of historical detail based on primary sources from China and interviews that I've conducted there, but also interviews that I've done with World Bank economists who were involved at the time. So the basic idea in the book is that in the 1980s, there was a confrontation between two kinds of reform economists who all wanted more market and wanted marketization, but one side of the debate was basically coming from neoclassical economics, arguing that the most important thing is to get the prices right, which meant that you needed a big bang in price reform, that you needed to liberalize, in particular, the most upstream, most essential goods as quickly as possible, combine this with macroeconomic austerity, which was then meant to achieve a stabilization of the general price level. And then you kind of set the stage for functioning market economy. So the logic went, which is basically the same kind of neoclassical logic that underpinned shock therapy in other contexts. China has ultimately not pursued this path, as I've also tried to elaborate in my introduction. China has instead pursued a path where market dynamics were introduced at the margins, which resulted in the so-called dual-track system, where the core of the planning institutions in the first instance continued to operate under state-set prices and under the whole institutional arrangement that was characteristic of the planned economy, while at the same time, markets were allowed to emerge, and these same state-owned enterprises and collective enterprises also engaged in market transactions. So in some sense, This is a nightmare for any kind of neoclassical economist, because it means that you have a large multiplicity of prices that are operating in different spheres, rather than clear price signals, which is perceived as the essential element of any kind of market economy from a standard neoclassical perspective. Now, the irony is that while in practice China has pursued such a gradualist, experimentalist path that I think defies the logic of neoclassical economics, at the same time, the economics departments within China have been restructured in a very foundational and comprehensive fashion based on the American example. So you get this tension between basically fully mainstream economics departments and also increasingly people who are trained in that fashion taking on responsibility within bureaucratic institutions, and a bureaucracy in a state that is operating on principles that are quite different from what standard neoclassical theory would suggest. Now, in this context of this kind of ideological creation of a new big narrative that we are observing right now, there is a new push towards strengthening the schools of Marxism, towards including Marxist language in economics texts and so on. But so far, I mean, I haven't been in China for a while. I'm stuck in the US, like most China scholars, so it's hard to really talk about what's going on as we speak. But I think it's some of the same challenges that Orsola has described for the international context are also present in the Chinese context, with the key difference that the logic of operation of the state, I think, has never fully been subsumed under the logic of the language of power of neoclassical economics, to use Orsola's I think very apt terminology. Maybe one quick comment on the question of a paradigm shift. Together with Daniela Gabor, we recently published a somewhat speculative and a provocative piece in the Financial Times, where we are warning that a form of carbon shock therapy could be in the cards for, in particular, the developing world. Because if you think about it, the challenge of a transition to a green economy is very much in parallel with the challenge of a transition to a market economy in the previous transition, so-called transition debates. And the main goal is also in parallel, which is a form of structural adjustment. You want to somehow change the composition, the structural composition of the economy towards becoming more green, whatever that precisely means, but that's the broad goal. Now, the most straightforward answer of basic neoclassical theory would be you have to adjust the price vector so that the individual economic units are reacting to a different set of price signals. Well, for this to work, you also have to impose macroeconomic austerity, because if you don't have austerity and you have inflation, which very easily happens if you increase the prices of the most upstream goods, such as energy. I guess the recent developments in the gas market in Europe should give you a taste of what that might look like, so that you can then get an agenda that basically emphasizes in a similar logical kind of fashion macroeconomic austerity and price adjustments that at the end of the day actually is not a constructive policy prescription for greening economies in the global south, where instead what you would really need is large-scale public investment financed by not only the local governments, but also by international collaboration, combined with technology transfers and so on. So this is just, we are not saying it's there yet, we're just warning that such an agenda might well be on the horizon. So in that sense, it seems likely that we get a paradigm shift for the policy of the core countries in the situation of emergency, but not necessarily for the policies of the rest of the world, which in some sense has already been reflected in the policy response to the COVID-19 crisis, and the difference that we have observed between powerful countries with a lot of fiscal space and poor countries.
Thank you to Isabella Weber. I have a very last question for you, Orsola Costantini. you gave us quite a gloomy picture of the situation right now. Do you believe in the interaction between the private companies and the state? There is any space for private companies to push for more multilateralism, or it's just an utopia? Thinking about private companies that now are much more sensible to green issues, for example, issues that until a few years ago they were not so sensible.
So I don't think we haven't seen it so far. I don't know why we should really see it now, but certainly we should not count on it.
Okay, it's a very straightforward question. Okay, thank you very much to Orsola Costantini that's here. You have a last question, a very last question, because we're...
Okay, so I wanted to ask to both of you, because what you said, I really agree with it, and I'm trying to look for a new shape to have in the economy. So what would be the impact of a global tax on capital movements, on the equilibrium between developing and developed countries in the form of surplus on export and surplus on import, and the way in which import substituting policies as well as export-oriented approach or neo-mercantilism in China is being developed? And what will be also the impact on redistributive dynamics between global South and global North in this way? And if that is good, why still hasn't happened? That's my question.
Should I start?
Sure.
Okay. Well, thank you. A global tax. So first of all, we've seen the discussions about global corporate tax, about the as suggested by Biden shortly after he got to power. It has to be sufficiently high to be effective. But most of all, the problems are, more structural. So when we talk about redistribution, we think that it's sufficient to keep things as they are and act on what's produced and redistributed, which is something that can be important, helping policy space locally in certain situations, in countries especially who do not have many revenues from their own domestic economies, tax revenues. But the main problem is income distribution, in my view. And this is a bit connected with what you were asking me before. If countries are allowed, if corporations, if corporations are allowed to, move from a country to country to another country, and not only based on taxation, but also on wage bargaining and race to the bottom that does not only pertain to fiscal and taxation, but also remuneration of employees and capacity to, pollute, or all sorts of elements. These corporations will not be, we cannot count on these corporations to be instrumental for any change. So I should correct my initial answer to your question, thinking of the role that certain parts of the big business in the US played during first the New Deal and then the Bretton Woods Conference. So in effect, there are conditions in which big business can be somehow instrumental to multilateralism. I wouldn't say that it's necessarily a good thing or something we should hope for, because they will always enforce, correctly so, their own interests, right? That's how it works. But these conditions have to do with precisely creating a landscape which includes a global tax, perhaps, but also includes other elements such as support of working conditions and wages and environmental rules that sort of force and reduction of the gains that corporations can make from pure speculative financial activity. So force them to go back to productive activity and force them to face a strong labor sector. Those are all elements that are necessary in order to create a more balanced relation between corporations and governments and labor. And so global tax is one part of a picture, in my view. And for the same reason why we cannot expect initiatives like the net zero finance network to succeed. Also, I don't think we can expect just a taxation approach to the problem can succeed alone.
Thank you. And Isabella Weber, do we have a last answer to this question?
Yeah, let me just say I agree that basically a global tax can be an important element, but it's not a magic bullet that will solve all the multitude of problems that we have discussed. On the note of the role of big business in multilateralism, it's interesting to note that actually business organizations in the US have been calling to end the trade war fairly recently, which I think could be an important step towards more multilateralism that could actually have positive implications for prospects for global cooperation. That being said, I think it's important to notice that we have a lot of discussion around trade imbalances in relationship to the US and China and how the big trade deficit on the part of the US is harming American workers and all of that. We have very little talk about how much this has benefited American companies, where the very vast majority that dominates key sectors in this trade is still headquartered in the US and in the EU, which also means that moves towards taxing these companies could be a policy measure that could take some of the pressure of this trade imbalance out of this dynamic in ways that is not predominantly pitching China as a whole against the US as a whole, but rather really calling out the relationship between capital and labor, if you want so, which is presenting itself along pretty different lines compared to the national confrontation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you to you both, and thank you to Jeffrey Sachs that is with us in spirit and not in person right now. And thank you to everybody for tonight. Goodbye.